Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating and little-known chapters of English medieval history, the survival of outlaws in the frozen forests during the harshest winters. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There was something strange happening in the forests of medieval England, a phenomenon that defied all logic, known by scholars and by the inhabitants of that time themselves. Men banished from society, without permanent shelter, without adequate provisions, without the slightest comfort that civilization could offer, managed to cross entire winters in conditions that killed trained soldiers inside heated castles. Temperatures that plummeted below zero, endless nights, blizzards that covered everything under a white and deadly mantle. And yet these men survived. The question that guides us on this journey is simple to formulate, but complex to answer. What did these outcasts know that we, with all our modern technology, seem to have completely forgotten? To comprehend this issue, we first need to understand what it meant to be declared an outlaw in medieval England. The English word outlaw carries within itself a literal definition that reveals all the brutality of that condition. It meant to be outside the law. It was not simply being a common criminal subject to trial and punishment. It was something infinitely worse. The person declared an outlaw ceased to exist in the eyes of legal protection. They became, in the words of the jurists of the time, caput lupinum, a wolf's head. Any common citizen could kill them wherever they found them. There was no need for a trial. There was no penalty for whoever took their life. There was not even the obligation for explanations. A body in a ditch, perhaps a small reward paid by the local sheriff, and the matter was closed. The declaration of outlawry followed a formal process in medieval courts. When someone was accused of a crime and did not appear for trial, the county sheriff was tasked with finding them. Appeals were made in various courts, offering the fugitive opportunities to surrender. However, if he continued evading capture, the court formally declared him an outlaw. Only men above 14 years of age could receive this sentence. For women, there was an equivalent condition called waived, which in practice meant the same cruel fate. The person lost all their goods, their money, their lands. Everything passed into the hands of the crown or was restored to local lords. Any contract in which they participated became null. Their civil existence simply disappeared. And here arises a question that may seem obvious, but which reveals deep layers of medieval society. Why would someone choose to live in the frozen forests, facing the almost certain possibility of dying from cold or hunger, when they could simply try to return to the city and start over discreetly? The answer is devastating in its simplicity. Cities were deadly traps for an outlaw. The neighbor who owed you money, the one with whom you had drunk beer the previous month, the one who knew your face and your story, any one of them could legally cut your throat and receive a reward for it. It was not a figure of speech. It was the daily reality of those times. The forest could kill slowly through cold and hunger. Civilization killed quickly and with pain. But who were, after all, these men who fled to the trees? Popular culture, fed by centuries of ballads and legends, has sold us the romantic image of noble highwaymen stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Figures like Robin Hood populate our imagination, fearless archers living merry adventures in Sherwood Forest. The historical reality, however, was dramatically different. The overwhelming majority of medieval outlaws was composed of desperate peasants, a farmer who failed to pay his debts, a hungry man who hunted a rabbit on lands that did not belong to him, someone who got involved in a tavern brawl and landed a blow that was too strong. They were not professional criminals. They were ordinary people who simply ran out of options. Historical records from the 13th century in England reveal enlightening data about this phenomenon. Among thousands of murderers prosecuted in that period, practically none belonged to the nobility or the knighthood. The true outlaws came from the lowest layers of society, people who already lived on the edge of subsistence and for whom a small stumble was enough to be pushed definitively out of the social order. The punishment for those captured was severe, hanging, and sometimes prior mutilation or branding with iron. Faced with these alternatives, the forest, with all its dangers, offered at least a chance. A slow and uncertain death was preferable to a quick and guaranteed death. And what forests were these? Here we arrive at a fact that may surprise those who imagine medieval England as a territory largely civilized and cultivated. At the height of the royal forest system, during the 12th and 13th centuries, approximately one-third of the entire area of southern England was designated as royal forest. It was not just about densely wooded areas, although many were. The term forest in the medieval sense derived from the Latin foris, meaning outside, and designated lands reserved for the exclusive hunting of the king and the nobility. These areas included woods, heaths, marshes, and various types of open terrain, all under special jurisdiction of forest law, which was distinct from common law and notoriously more severe. This vast territory was, for the most part, without effective patrolling. The sheriffs and their men had horses, and horses require paths. The deep interior of the forests offered neither adequate trails nor sufficient clearings for the movement of mounted patrols. The sheriff's men tended to stay on the edges and on the main roads, where they could move efficiently. The depths of the woods, with their dense vegetation and irregular terrain, remained as unexplored territory for authority. For a man willing to face the difficulties of wildlife, there were miles and miles where the forces of the law simply did not reach. And here arises an interesting paradox. Winter, which would naturally be considered the most dangerous season for those living in the open, actually offered certain tactical advantages to fugitives. Frozen ground does not retain footprints like the soft mud of autumn. A group of the sheriff's men tracking a fugitive through the mud of October could follow his trail for miles, each step leaving revealing marks on the soaked ground. But the frost of December erased the traces. The tracks disappeared. The earth, hardened by the cold, became an ally of those who needed to hide. Thus these desperate men chose the trees. They chose the cold. They chose a probable death instead of a certain death. But surviving a medieval winter in the forests required much more than simply hiding. It required specific knowledge of shelter, of fire, of food, of water, of social organization. And the methods they developed were surprisingly ingenious. The first challenge faced by any fugitive newly arrived in the forest was finding a place to sleep that would not kill him during the night. Exposure to the freezing temperatures of the medieval dawn could be fatal in a matter of hours, not days, hours. A person wet and exhausted in temperatures near zero could develop lethal hypothermia in less than 3 hours. Shelter was not a luxury. It was the difference between waking up the next day or never waking up at all. The first choice was always to look for caves. Any experienced outlaw searched the region for rocky ledges, shallow caves, any natural formation that offered protection. The reason was simple. Rock retains heat much better than any structure that could be built with bare hands. Furthermore, it did not require assembly. Nature had already done the heavy work millions of years before. An adequate cave could mean the difference between life and death in the first critical days of flight. However, good caves were rare and others also knew them. Wolves sought shelter in rocky formations. Bears hibernated in natural cavities. And other outlaws, who perhaps did not wish for company, might already be installed. Competition for natural shelters was fierce, and it did not always end peacefully. Without a cave available, it was time to dig. Pit houses, as they were known, represented an ingenious solution developed over generations. The fugitive excavated a hole approximately 1 meter deep, covered it with branches and plant debris, and crawled inside. The principle behind this technique was the thermal constancy of the subsoil. At about 1 meter below the surface, the soil temperature remains relatively stable throughout the year, hovering around 10 degrees Celsius. It was not exactly tropical, but 10 degrees easily surpassed the 5 or 10 below zero of the surface during a winter night. For a man wearing stolen wool and whose last meal had been a squirrel, this difference could mean survival. There were also hollow logs. At first glance, the idea seems absurd, something out of a children's tale. But large fallen trees, with the interior rotted by time, worked surprisingly well in emergency situations. The small space heated up quickly with body heat. It was not comfortable, but it kept the person alive. For larger groups, a technique known as a bough shelter was developed. They sought young and flexible trees, which were bent to form natural arches. Over this structure, thick layers of vegetation were piled: ferns, dry leaves, moss. The ideal thickness was approximately 60 centimeters on all sides. The result was a kind of giant vegetable cocoon, capable of sheltering several people and retaining the collective heat of their bodies. The location of these shelters mattered enormously. South-facing slopes caught what little winter sun was available. Hills positioned behind the shelter blocked northern winds. A positioning error could transform a perfect refuge into a freezing wind tunnel. And as for the snow that accumulated against the walls of the shelter, the outlaws learned to leave it. The dead air trapped between the layers of snow worked as additional insulation. Centuries before any scientific theory about thermal insulation, these men had empirically discovered what modern survival experts teach in expensive courses. However, even the best shelter was useless without a critical element: fire. And managing fire while hiding from people actively committed to hunting, you required tricks that most people have completely forgotten. Fire was not simply nice to have, it was absolutely essential. The difference between waking up the next day and becoming a frozen corpse for wolves to find. Without fire, there was no adequate heating during the coldest nights. Without fire, there was no way to prepare food or purify water. Outlaws treated the ability to make and maintain fire with the same importance that we today treat our cell phones. They could not function without it. But here is the fundamental problem. Fire produces smoke. And smoke visible from miles away was essentially an advertisement screaming the fugitive's location to any patrol that was searching. A column of smoke rising from the trees could attract the sheriff's men in a matter of hours. Lighting a fire carelessly was practically the same as turning oneself in. And so what did they do? They developed ingeniously sophisticated techniques. The most efficient was known as the Dakota fire pit. The principle was simple, but the execution required skill. 2 holes were dug in the ground, connected by an underground tunnel. One hole served as the combustion chamber, where the fire was lit. The other worked as an air intake, feeding the flames from below. The result was an extremely hot fire that produced a minimum amount of visible smoke. The fire burned more completely and efficiently, with fewer particles escaping into the air. This technique represented true medieval engineering applied to survival. Mastering its construction required practice and patience. First attempts frequently failed. The connection between the holes needed to have the correct angle. The combustion chamber required adequate dimensions, but when it worked, it was extraordinarily effective. Fuel was also crucial. Wet wood produced dense white smoke, equivalent to a flare for any observer. Experienced outlaws learned to store dry wood inside their shelters for weeks before burning it. Fallen branches were collected and left to dry in the protected interior. Patience was literally a matter of survival. The tools to start the fire became possessions more valuable than anything else. Flint and steel, often the only metallic objects an outlaw possessed, were wrapped in leather and kept close to the body at all times. Losing your fire kit in December meant death. There was no alternative, there was no second chance. Night presented additional challenges. Heat was necessary for sleeping, but flames glow in the darkness. The solution was to build fires in pits or behind natural rock screens that blocked the light from distant observers. A careless fire on a high ridge could be seen for miles. The sheriff's men could arrive in a few hours. The technique of preserving embers was also developed. Before sleeping, the outlaws buried hot coals under layers of ash and dry earth. At dawn, they uncovered the still living embers and restarted the fire without the dangerous and time-consuming process of creating sparks. This technique saved countless lives throughout the centuries. However, keeping warm was only half the battle. Staying dry mattered even more. And here we reach a point that most people get wrong about medieval winters. The common assumption is that cold air was the killer. It was not. It was damp cold that killed. An outlaw could endure freezing temperatures if he remained dry. What he could not survive was getting soaked and remaining so. Wool became the most valuable fabric of existence for these men. A soaked wool cloak still retained approximately 80% of its insulating capacity. Linen and cotton, in contrast, became death sentences the moment they got wet. The fabric stuck to the skin, sucking the heat from the body faster than the freezing air itself could. Outlaws wore wool, and lots of wool. But there was an even more ingenious technique. Many used stolen sheepskins with the fur turned inward against the body. The same principle as the synthetic fleece jackets we buy today in specialized stores. We discovered that we invented nothing new. We only made the material artificial. Feet represented a particular problem. The shoes of medieval peasants were essentially leather socks with pretensions of footwear. Useless in the snow, even worse in the frozen mud. Experienced outlaws adopted wool leg wraps, strips of fabric wrapped around the feet and legs. It seems primitive, and it was, but these wraps could be adjusted for comfort, dried faster than any shoe, and could be replaced from any available piece of fabric. Animal fat became another survival tool. Outlaws rubbed it into leather and wool to create a rudimentary waterproofing. The smell was absolutely terrible. It worked surprisingly well. That greasy coating blocked the wind and repelled light rain, extending the useful life of the clothes by months. And the attacks on farms to steal clothes, these were not crimes of greed. They were survival missions. Outlaws attacked isolated properties in autumn specifically in search of wool cloaks and blankets. A good heavy cloak genuinely meant the difference between seeing spring and becoming a frozen corpse. But staying warm created another problem entirely. All that wool and animal fat was useless if one could not put food in the stomach. And winter hunting required knowledge that could lead to the gallows. Poaching the king's deer was punishable by death. Outlaws did it anyway. The reason was simple survival arithmetic. Threats of execution do not frighten when hunger is already killing first. A single red deer provided more than 20 kilos of meat. That represented weeks of survival from a single successful hunt. It was worth the risk when ribs were already showing through the skin. But smart outlaws did not go directly for big game. It was too dangerous, it attracted too much attention. Rabbits were the true champions of winter survival. Technically, they were not classified as game under forest law, which meant that traps near the edges of the forest could capture dinner without automatically yielding a death sentence. A simple snare of vegetable fiber positioned along a rabbit trail worked while the hunter slept. Passive income, medieval style. And winter actually helped the hunters. It may seem contradictory, but fresh snow transformed the entire forest into a tracking map. Every deer, every rabbit, every squirrel left a perfect record of where it had gone and when. Animals also became desperate in deep winter, less cautious, hungrier, just like the outlaws who hunted them. There were also smaller prey that most would not consider. Squirrels were permitted, as were dormice and hedgehogs. There was not much meat on any of them, but constant protein accumulated. Wild pigeons remained during the winter, crows and pheasants as well. Simple traps made of bent branches could capture them with minimum effort and noise. The real skill, however, lay in preservation. Fresh meat spoils quickly, even in cold weather. Outlaws smoked their prey over low fires for days, creating dried meat that lasted for months. It was not gourmet cuisine. It was survival chemistry. Dried meat could be eaten cold during dangerous moments when lighting a fire meant death. But hunting and trapping only worked if the fugitive knew the forest. And knowing the forest meant understanding what grew there, even when everything seemed dead. Winter forests presented a desolate aspect. Bare branches, frozen ground, no green in sight. Most people would starve in a week. The outlaws did not die. They knew secrets that kept them alive when the landscape seemed to offer absolutely nothing. Acorns were a perfect example. One could not simply eat them raw. They were full of tannins that would cause violent sickness. But the outlaws discovered a solution. They buried them in a stream bed where cold water flowed constantly over them. They waited about 3 weeks. The water leached out all that bitter substance. What remained was something that could be ground into a kind of flour, capable of effectively keeping a person alive. There was also the squirrel strategy. These small animals spent all autumn burying nuts in various places. The outlaws observed them carefully in early winter, noting exactly where they dug. Later, when the squirrels returned to fetch their reserves, an attentive observer arrived first. But the strangest source of food was tree bark. It sounds desperate because it was. The inner layer of elm, birch, and pine, called cambium, contained enough nutrients to prevent starvation. The outlaws stripped it off, boiled it until it formed a paste, and swallowed it with difficulty. The taste was absolutely terrible. It worked anyway. Wild rose bushes were the true treasure. Those small red fruits remained on the bushes until January, and they contained something that the outlaws did not understand scientifically, but that their bodies desperately needed: vitamin C. Without it, gums bled, teeth loosened, wounds did not heal. A handful of rose hips every few days prevented all of that. Certain mushrooms also thrived in freezing temperatures. Bracket fungus and velvet shank grow on dead logs throughout the winter. One only needed to know what one was looking for. And that was the crucial part: which plants killed versus which plants kept alive. This was not information that could be guessed. One wrong mushroom meant an agonizing death. A correct identification meant another week of survival. This knowledge passed between groups of outlaws like precious currency. But finding food was only half the challenge. The other half was finding water when everything was frozen. And here we come to something that no one thinks about regarding winter. One was surrounded by water on all sides, frozen water everywhere, snow accumulating, icicles hanging from every branch, streams turned into ice, and yet dehydration killed more outlaws than one would expect. It seems absurd, doesn't it? But eating snow directly was essentially slow suicide. The body needed to burn precious calories to melt it, and that quickly reduced the core temperature. In terms of survival, one was trading hydration for hypothermia. A bad deal. And there was the math that made everything worse. Approximately 10 handfuls of snow were needed to obtain 1 handful of liquid water. That meant a lot of melting, which required constant access to fire, which we have already established was a risky business. So what actually worked? Smart outlaws found spots where the streams moved fastest. These sections often remained unfrozen, even in the brutal cold. Moving water does not freeze so easily. Finding a small waterfall, or a narrowing where the current accelerated, meant having liquid water without the need for fire. Then there were the icicles. Many have licked an icicle at some point in life, but outlaws preferred those hanging from rock faces instead of tree branches. Ground snow collected dirt, animal excrement, rotted leaves. Icicles formed from runoff were essentially filtered, a natural filter, so to speak. But obtaining water was only half the problem. Keeping it liquid during the night was the real headache. Outlaws carried water in animal bladders or stolen leather bottles tucked against the body, under the cloak, close to the chest. Body heat prevented it from freezing while they slept. Uncomfortable, absolutely. Better than waking up with a useless ball of ice, also absolutely. The treacherous part of winter dehydration was that one did not feel thirst. Cold air is dry air. Every exhaled breath carried moisture away. Outlaws needed to drink even when they did not want to. But staying hydrated alone was not enough. Winter survival was not an individual sport, and the groups that formed in those frozen forests had their own brutal rules. The thing about being a loner in medieval forests was simple. It usually meant being a dead loner. Outlaws who remained alone had approximately half the survival rate of those who grouped together. And the math was not complicated. One person sleeping alone in a shelter froze. 3 people huddled together. Body heat alone could raise the temperature by 10 degrees or more. This was not teamwork. It was basic thermodynamics saving lives. But one could not simply team up with anyone who wandered through the forest. The sweet spot seemed to be groups of 5 to 15 people. Fewer than that, and one could not manage all the survival tasks. More than that, and it became impossible to feed everyone. Furthermore, large groups left tracks that even a blind sheriff could follow. The division of labor transformed these bands of outlaws into efficient small societies. One person tended the fire, another checked the traps. Someone watched the trail for patrols. The others foraged. In winter, when daylight lasted perhaps 8 hours, this multiplication of efforts was essential. Trust networks developed along the forest paths. Allied camps shared information about where the sheriff's men were heading, or which areas still had game. Betrayal always lurked. Many outlaws were captured because a desperate companion traded information for a pardon. Starving in February, with frozen toes, and suddenly the sheriff offers a warm bed and a clean slate. It was a hard deal to refuse. The larger winter camps sometimes grew until they became true communities. Women and children lived there. Hierarchies formed. Leaders emerged. They were no longer just hiding places. They were small, illegal villages operating under the king's nose. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Outlaws did not survive only by hiding and hunting. Sometimes they had to take what they needed directly from people who possessed it. And winter raids required a completely different type of planning. The issue was morally complicated. Surviving the winter meant taking things that belonged to other people. Period. There was no way around it. The best targets were isolated monasteries and rural estates. These places stockpiled food specifically for the winter. Grain, salted meat, wool blankets, tools. Basically medieval warehouses situated in the countryside with minimum security. But successful attackers were not simply desperate men charging blindly. That led to death or capture. The smart ones observed their targets for days first. When did the guards change shifts? Where were the dogs kept? Which buildings stored the good stuff versus which had armed men sleeping inside? Timing was crucial. Heavy snow was perfect. One attacked the place, took what one could carry, and disappeared among the trees. By morning, fresh snow completely covered the tracks. The sheriff's men would find nothing but footprints leading to a white wall of forest. Something surprising that emerges from historical research is that salt was often worth more than stealing silver. Seriously, one could not eat silver, but salt meant being able to preserve meat throughout the spring. A good raid for salt could keep a camp alive for months. And not every encounter was violent. Some villages actually traded with the outlaws. It seems crazy, but thinking from a peasant's perspective, the logic made sense. Fight an armed and desperate group and perhaps lose the winter hay reserves to fire. Or trade some grain and cloth for a promise that they would be left alone. The practical outweighs the heroic every time. The most successful outlaws did not just steal food. They took tools, seeds, anything that suggested long-term planning, because deep down, most hoped for eventual pardons. They did not plan to die in the forest. They planned to rebuild lives someday. It makes sense, doesn't it? Survival today, but always an eye on tomorrow. Still, raiding was a gamble every time. One bad raid, one witness who escaped, one dog that barked too early, and the game was over. But even successful raiders faced something worse than sheriffs. The true killer arrived at the end of February and had nothing to do with the law. The question that remains is, what happened to these people? Did they all end up swinging on ropes? Actually, no. Most outlaw stories ended much less dramatically than the ballads suggest. Royal pardons were surprisingly common. When kings needed soldiers for wars in France or Scotland, they suddenly became very lenient. Murder, robbery, poaching the royal deer, all forgiven if you carried a spear into battle. Curious how crimes became negotiable when someone needed cannon fodder. But here is the darker truth. The sheriffs did not kill most outlaws. Diseases killed them. Pneumonia from a night that was too wet. Infected wounds that became gangrenous. Dysentery from contaminated water. The forest was not a romantic refuge. It was basically a medieval hospital waiting room where no one was ever called. The true killer, however, arrived at the end of February. That hungry gap between when stockpiled food ran out and spring plants emerged. There are accounts of outlaw camps found completely empty. No sign of violence, just people who simply stopped. Hunger is silent like that. Some were lucky in strange ways. A relative died, they inherited land, and suddenly that desperate criminal from the forest returned to the city as a legal owner. No one asked questions when there was property involved, just like today actually. And those legendary figures who supposedly lived decades in the woods. The documented average was 2 to 7 years. That was all. Robin Hood surviving 40 years in Sherwood was either complete fiction or he had a very good accountant hiding him somewhere warm. The survivors, those who crossed multiple winters, became something valuable. Teachers. Their knowledge of shelter construction, fire management, and food preservation kept newcomers alive. Experience became a currency more valuable than stolen silver. Most outlaws were neither heroes nor villains. They were desperate people trapped between frozen forests and legal systems that offered them nothing but the gallows. Some found ways out. Some died silently in the cold. Some probably simply went home one day and hoped no one remembered their faces. The medieval forest was not a fantasy of freedom. It was a brutal test of survival that most people failed, but those who passed were tougher than any legend gives them credit for. They developed knowledge that crossed centuries, techniques that modern survival experts rediscover and teach in expensive courses. The difference is that for those men and women of the medieval forests, there was no certificate at the end. There was only another day of life, snatched by force from a world that had declared them dead before they had even fallen. The story of these outlaws teaches us something profound about human nature. When pushed to the absolute limit, when all the doors of society close and the alternatives reduce to dying one way or another, some individuals find within themselves resources they did not even know they possessed. They observe nature, learn from it, adapt to it. They form communities where none should exist. They find hope where only despair exists. And occasionally, against all odds, they survive to tell their stories. These stories reached us because they were passed from mouth to mouth, from camp to camp, from generation to generation. Survival knowledge became oral tradition, refined over centuries of trial and error. What remained was a body of practical wisdom that worked, that kept people alive in conditions that killed others. Today, sitting in our heated homes, we can look back and marvel at the resilience of those who came before. They were not superhuman. They were ordinary people, forced by extraordinary circumstances to discover what they were capable of doing when there was no other option left. And perhaps that is the most lasting lesson of their stories. Within every person exists a capacity for adaptation and survival that remains dormant while life remains comfortable. The medieval outlaws were forced to awaken that capacity, and in doing so, they left us a legacy of knowledge that transcends their time and place. If this journey through the frozen forests of medieval England sparked your curiosity and you wish to continue exploring stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Each subscription helps us bring more documentary narratives about the forgotten chapters of human history. If this content resonated with you, leave your like and share it with someone who appreciates discovering the hidden stories behind the legends, and in the comments tell us, what other historical period would you like to explore with us? Your suggestions help us shape the future of the channel. Until the next journey through the past,